This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
Hello and welcome to Crimelines, sort of. This week, I am releasing an episode from Beyond the Files, which you can find on Patreon, Apple subscriptions, and Supercast. It is $5 a month, and you get 2 Beyond the Files episodes every month, and all Crimelines episodes, you also get those ad-free. Beyond the Files is where I take Forensic Files episodes and I get into all of the other details that they left out and things that they either misrepresented or rewrote to make the narrative better. We get into all of that. As I mentioned in my end of last year, beginning of this year episode, some of these episodes turned out to not be solved. I thought I could cover all of these episodes behind a paywall because if they're on the Forensic Files, they're solved. But that turns out to not be entirely true. Some of these cases have been overturned on appeal, or there is good reason to believe they're wrongful conviction cases, so they are technically unsolved. Since I was just away for 2 weeks in South America on an amazing trip, you can see more on my private Instagram. Well, I mean, it's public, but it's my personal Instagram. It is Charlie in KC. That's Charlie INKC. You can see tons of pictures. But basically, because I took 2 weeks off, it seemed like this would be a good opportunity to take one of the Beyond the Files episodes that is considered disputed in its outcome and put it on the main feed. It gives everyone a taste of what the show is like. You know, try it before you buy it. But it also is getting those unsolved cases out from behind the paywall. I will be doing that with any of these Beyond the Files episodes that I come across that end up being either technically unsolved, actually unsolved, or wrongful convictions, or even disputed, and they seem that they are likely wrongful convictions. I know I mentioned that the show may be available at some point in the future to everybody ad-supported, and I got a lot of actual positive. I only got positive feedback on that idea. But until that day comes, I think I will be using the Beyond the Files episodes that are of a disputed outcome to fill in the blanks a bit when I take time off. So with all of that said, the episode I wanted to share today actually takes place in Kansas City. It is very local to me, not just being in Kansas City, but some of the areas that I came across on my research are actually really close to my house. But something that really struck me with this is how the victim's family, particularly his widow, reacted to the legal entanglements in this case. This one is quite a ride in the sense that it brings up some very important issues within the legal system and how we find what we call justice. So without further ado, this is the Beyond the Files episode on the case of Richard Armitage. An attorney was killed in his downtown Kansas City office, and the state said forensics proved who his killer was. So the question is, if the forensics were so strong, why did they have to violate his rights to convict him? From Season 10, Episode 42 of the Forensic Files, this is Enemy Within. Hello and welcome to Beyond the Files, a podcast where I, Charlie, take cases that were covered on the Forensic Files and I tell you the rest of the story. And in this case, the story took a sharp left turn after the Forensic Files episode aired in 2005. So we have a lot to get into. This is one of the few Forensic Files episodes that has been pulled from circulation. I managed to find a place to watch it. Someone with a copy of an international airing of the show, uploaded it to Facebook of all places. And the reason I know it's the international version is because it's called Medical Detectives. For those who don't know, Forensic Files originally aired on TLC under the name Medical Detectives. But then the first 4 seasons were purchased and the show was rebranded into the Forensic Files. But in some international television markets, it continued under the same name, Medical Detectives, and that's why that was the title card on the episode I watched, even though this episode was several seasons into the run of the Forensic Files. As far as I can tell, nothing was cut from the version I watched because the runtime was about 22 minutes, so I don't think I missed anything. So you're not going to find this episode while you're binge watching Forensic Files on TV or through the Peacock app or wherever else you watch it. And I think the episodes they pulled are the ones we need to take another look at. Because when the public and narrative gets turned on its head, quietly pulling down the episode doesn't really address the actual issues. So we'll address them here, but first we need to get started. And we are going to start with a man named Richard Armitage, who was born in September of 1950 in Nevada, Missouri. Richard graduated from Southern Methodist University Law School in Texas, and then he moved to Kansas City, Missouri in the mid-1970s to get his law practice up and running. While Richard was working on getting the practice going, he was pulling shifts as a bartender in the Westport area of Kansas City, just so he could pay the bills. It was at the bar where he was working where he met the people who started the Midwest Organ Bank, which is now called the Midwest Transplant Center, and it is located in Westwood, Kansas. Westwood is just over the state line from Kansas City, Missouri, and researching this case is when I learned it is actually a city. It is a city 8 miles from my front door, and I thought this entire time it was just a neighborhood. I mean, it's about the size of one, but it is just an example of all the things I learn while prepping this podcast. Anyway, as Richard talked with these people about the issues around organ donation, he got interested in that area of law. This is a very specific area that not every attorney can just jump in and do. So Richard studied up on it, and he became one of the attorneys in the United States who worked with hospitals and transplant networks. He worked on legislation, procurement, Medicare reimbursements, corporate compliance development, as well as a number of other healthcare-related issues that come up when you're talking about transplants. That wasn't enough to fill his entire practice, so he did do other healthcare law. And a bit off his specialty, he would also work in debt collections. Again, just another way to have income coming in while he followed his passion, which was working on these transplant-related issues. Richard did marry, and he and his wife Tracy had 4 children before they divorced in 1997. They were both hands-on parents who put the kids first, both before, during, and after the divorce. And that always helps make a divorce less contentious than it could have been. In July of 1999, Richard remarried a woman named Kathy, and they had a baby girl together. Richard was known to be a nice guy, without much of an ego. His preferred area of law was not highly contentious. It was about people coming together to save lives, and to do so legally and ethically. Sure, the collection side could rile up some tempers, but that's in the clients, not really the lawyers. Richard wasn't the type to be an aggressive trial attorney, and he didn't have to be. There was plenty of law to practice that does not require him to go into a courtroom. Richard's life was pretty simple. He went to work, and then he came home and spent time with his family. Richard's law firm was called Armitage & Buckley, with Buckley being Richard Buckley. Because they are both named Richard, I'm going to call Richard Buckley just by his last name going forward. Buckley was a friend of Richard's and they formed a partnership in their practice, but they didn't generally work together. Buckley focused on civil litigation, so their areas of expertise didn't overlap much. They shared a secretary/assistant named Shannon, and they had a shared office space on the 13th floor of the Power and Light building, which is located in downtown Kansas City. The Armitage-Buckley law offices took up about a third of the floor, but the rest was empty. I could go into an entire history lesson of the Power and Light building and the decline and the conversion to apartments, but I'll spare you. Let's just say it didn't surprise me to learn that in 2000, 2/3 of the 13th floor was unoccupied, and the other third was occupied by a very small law firm. Anyway, that brings us to Friday, May 5th, 2000. Richard had plans to work during the day, but leave in time to go help with the concession stand at his daughter's soccer game. That really was Richard's idea of a fun Friday night. Time with his kids while helping out in the community. In the office that morning were both his partner Buckley and their office assistant Shannon. Things were pretty quiet, and Shannon left for her lunch break around 1:40. When Shannon got back an hour later at 2:40, she saw Buckley standing outside of the building smoking. He said he had just gotten back from lunch himself and he was finishing a cigarette before he headed in. The two chatted a bit before they went up in the elevator together. They got to the office but found that the door was locked. They assumed that meant Richard had left for lunch himself, and that seemed to be confirmed after they let themselves in and Shannon peeked into Richard's office and didn't see him there. Shannon sat at her desk to get some work done when she heard what she later said sounded like growling coming from Richard's office. It was followed by a light thud and a groan, so she went in there to see what was going on. This time, she didn't just peer in. She went in and looked over his desk. There, she saw Richard's desk chair knocked over, and Richard himself was on the ground with blood around his head. She knew he wasn't dead, though, because she saw him move one arm and a leg, so Shannon yelled for Buckley, who rushed in. He told Shannon to call 911 while he administered first aid. Buckley had been in the military, so he had first aid training, and he moved Richard out to a more open area where he could then lie him flat for CPR. But before he started it, Buckley realized Richard was actually still breathing. Shannon heard Buckley yell Richard's name repeatedly while clapping his hands. Buckley would later say that his military training had taught him that if you could get someone's attention and keep them awake during a time like this, that was half the battle. The 911 dispatcher Shannon was talking to instructed them to find something to put on the wound that would stop the bleeding. Buckley grabbed a plastic bag and tried to use that, but he soon cast it to the side. Richard's wound wasn't actually bleeding that much anymore. Crime scene investigators would find that the blood was clotting, meaning Richard had been attacked at least 5 to 15 minutes before the paramedics got to the scene. Buckley stayed with Richard and only backed off when the EMTs got there and could take over. Richard was transported to the hospital in critical condition. His family was told that, unfortunately, there was very little chance he would make it. There was just too much extensive brain damage. And then 2 days later, on Sunday, May 7th, 49-year-old Richard Armitage died from his injuries, leaving behind a wife and 5 children, the youngest of whom was just 6 months old. And yes, his wife did what we know Richard would have wanted, and she signed for his organs to be donated. The initial belief here, due to the appearance of Richard's head wound, was that Richard had been shot in the back of his head. But it turned out he had not been. The autopsy showed that he had been struck around 9 times with a weapon that left crescent-shaped wounds. All of the reporting from the time of the murder through the Forensic Files episode says that the weapon was possibly a hammer. However, the television show Crime Scene Confidential reported in 2022 that a small art sculpture on Richard's desk was missing, and that may have been the murder weapon. I have seen that information in 0 other places. 15 news articles, 1 other TV show, a comprehensive write-up from the University of Michigan, and 2 appellate documents. I saw no mention of a missing sculpture. There is a reference to a missing bat in 1 other place, but generally if the murder weapon was mentioned at all, it said that it may have been a hammer. So I have no idea where this idea of a sculpture mentioned in Crime Scene Confidential came from. One of the first things they wanted to do was build out a timeline for everyone in the office, which included, as we know, 3 people: Richard, Buckley, and Shannon. Starting with Shannon, she said she left for lunch around 1:40, which Buckley agreed with. He said he left about 10 minutes after she did, and when he left, Richard was on the phone. Phone records showed that Richard was on a call with a client in California starting at 1:46. Buckley said that after he left the office, he used the bathroom, took the elevator down 13 floors, and headed out to his car. He went to a fast food restaurant, but the line was too long, so he left, and he ended up stopping at an office supply store to buy some toner that Shannon had said they needed. His receipt showed that he checked out at 2:22 p.m. Buckley then went back to the office, getting there around 2:30 or so. He smoked a cigarette and then headed back up with Shannon. As far as Richard went, phone records showed that his call ended at 2:01. Richard then got online. A lot of assumptions were made about Richard getting online. And you will hear these assumptions repeated again and again in the timeline of this case as though it is set in stone 100% fact. But it's not. The internet company records that would have shown exactly when his computer connected to the internet had been destroyed by the time someone went to look for them. All we know is that Richard's computer connected to the internet and he was looking at a perfume website. The story is that he was shopping for perfume for a Mother's Day present for his wife, but that is conjecture that is seeping into the narrative. A perfume website was pulled up on his computer, but we don't know why he was on that website. And like I said, we don't know exactly when either because the internet records had not been preserved. This was a dial-up modem, so he could not have gotten on until after he hung up the phone call. It would have taken a little bit of time to log in for my listeners who remember those days. I bet some of us can even remember the sound of the modem connecting in our minds. So the earliest he could have whirred and beep-bopped up this modem to connect to the internet was 2:02 p.m. It could have been later, but we know it couldn't have been any earlier because he was on the phone. $2025 is a low spend year for me. I like my money where I can see it, which means in my wallet. Unfortunately, traditional big wireless carriers prefer to see my money in their wallets. I was fed up with the high bills and the random fees and then perks that turned out to not save me anything, so I have just switched over to Mint Mobile. I have their unlimited plan, so this is the most expensive one, and I'm still saving $300 a year. And that's just my phone. I also have a husband and kids, so let's multiply that savings by 4. You could actually save even more since Mint Mobile premium wireless plans actually start as low as $15 a month, and you're not giving up anything. All of the plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. I have never had any issues with coverage, and you get to bring your phone and phone number over with any Mint Mobile plan and get 3 months of premium wireless service from Mint Mobile for $15 a month. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/crimelines. That's mintmobile.com/crimelines. Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5 GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for the first 3 months only, and then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. Are you ready to unlock the secret to healthier, younger-looking skin? As we age, the collagen in our body decreases, leading to fine lines, wrinkles, and sagging skin. But what if the solution to a radiant, youthful glow was simpler than you think? Introducing Native Path Collagen, your ally in the quest for a radiant complexion. Their collagen peptides pack a powerful punch. It supports not just your skin, but also your hair, joints, bones, and even gut health. Just imagine a smoother, more youthful you, all while you're sitting here listening to podcasts. One of the things I like most about Native Path Collagen is it's completely unflavored and it dissolves easily, so you can add it to coffee or smoothies, or like I've said before, even your baking recipes. Are you ready to try it? Head to getnativepath.com/crimelines now and get up to 45% off your first order plus free shipping. You'll even get access to exclusive bundles not available anywhere else. And don't worry, Native Path offers a 365-day money-back guarantee. So what are you waiting for? Join the 1 million happy customers and visit getnativepath.com/crimelines today for 45% off plus free shipping.
Let's be honest. Most of us have a love-hate relationship with wired bras. We love the lift, but hate the digging. We love the support, but hate feeling trapped. Well, Knix just changed everything with FreeFlex, a wired bra actually designed to work with your body, not against it. FreeFlex features a revolutionary, flexible wire that moves when you move, bends when you bend, and keeps everything exactly where you want it. No poking, no stabbing, no constant readjusting, just freedom to move. It also has a demi-cup shape for a natural lift with a lower neckline that flatters in everything from V-necks to dresses. And because it's from Knix, it's available in sizes for every body. Experience the first wired bra you'll actually want to wear all day. Visit Knix.com for 15% off your order with FreeFlex15. That's KNIX.com, code FreeFlex15 for 15% off. Knix.com.
Due to the clotting of blood at the scene, it was believed that Richard had not been attacked any later than 2:25 to 2:35. So we have a window. 2:02 is the absolute earliest he could have been attacked because it gave him time to get on the internet, and it couldn't have been any later than around 2:30, give or take 5 minutes. That's the window they're working with. In canvassing the building for witnesses, the investigator started leaning closer to the earlier side of that window because the downstairs office neighbor said that they heard banging shortly after 2. They described it as the sound of something falling over, and it could have been the desk chair when that got knocked over, or it could have been Richard after he fell to the ground. The crime scene also helped them provide a bit of a profile of the person who attacked Richard, and that profile was pretty simple. It was someone he knew. And the reason they believed this may sound silly, but his shoes were off. Richard had the habit of kicking off his shoes if he was sitting at his desk, so long as there were no clients in the office. If there were, obviously he kept his shoes on. If someone knocked at the front door of the office, he would have put them on before opening it. And if someone had walked in, they had a chime on the door, so he would have had time to slip his shoes back on before he saw who came in. Now, I guess if someone rushed into the office, maybe he wouldn't have had a chance to get his shoes on, or, it wouldn't have been his first thought with an intruder, but there were also no signs of a struggle. There was a distinct lack of defensive wounds on Richard. It didn't appear like he tried to block any of the blows. It looked instead like the first blow took him by surprise from the back and knocked him to the floor where the rest of the attack occurred. Once on the ground, Richard would not have had a chance to defend himself. So if this was a seemingly friendly stranger, Richard's shoes would have been on. And if this was an unfriendly stranger who barged in, he wouldn't have turned his back to them. So that leads to the conclusion that Richard knew his attacker well enough to be casual around them. Even though this was the running belief, the investigators did ask Shannon and Buckley about any angry clients or opponents in Richard's cases, and Shannon could only think of one person. The Forensic Files episode called him Lou Campbell, and the Crime Scene Confidential episode called him Thomas Platt. Neither show disclosed that they were changing his name, so I'm not sure which one of them did or if both of them did. I'm going to just call him Lou since I base this show on the Forensic Files presentations of cases, but I do suspect that Forensic Files would have absolutely changed someone's name without disclosing it. Lou was the boyfriend of a woman who was being evicted, and Richard was handling the case from the evictor's side. Lou was upset about how it was being handled and had made some phone calls that were characterized as threatening. The police interviewed Lou and they searched his home. They ended up finding a shirt with blood on it in his house, so they sent that off to the lab. It looked kind of promising, but the blood turned out to be Lou's own blood. He was eventually cleared, and it's my impression that he was cleared mostly because of his alibi. The investigators had another piece of evidence that they were going over that would end up central to this case, and that was video footage. The entrance to the building was covered by a security camera. The investigators had a window of time when the crime happened, but it was possible that someone entered the building earlier, so they backed it up and they watched and noted every person they saw go in through the door. Neither of Richard's wives, the ex or the current, went through that door, and their alibis checked out, so this eliminated them. They also didn't see Lou go into the building or leave it that day. They did see Shannon leave around 1:40, like she said, and then they waited. Buckley did not come out of that door at 1:50, like he said, or 1:55, or even 2 o'clock. He didn't leave until the video timestamp hit 2:06 p.m., which was 15 minutes later than he said. Obviously, the police noticed discrepancies in timelines like this, but this would have still given Buckley, if he had done this, only 4 to 5 minutes to commit the crime and make it down to the exit, and that seemed like too tight of a timeline. But then, nearly 2 weeks later, one of the detectives went to verify the timestamp, and he compared what the camera's internal clock said against his own pager. According to him, his pager was 3 minutes ahead of the camera. Additionally, the ambulance emergency dispatch logs showed that their arrival time was also a few minutes off from the timestamp on the footage. So if we adjust for this, it meant Buckley didn't leave until as late as 2:09. So if Richard hung up that call at 2:01 and managed to boot up the internet by 2:02, this would have given Buckley up to 7 minutes to commit this murder. It would have been tight, but this would have actually been doable. But the question was, why would he have done it? Based on witness statements, all was not well in their legal partnership. Richard had told his wife that Buckley was not very good with money. He would spend a lot to try to win a case, like hiring experts or traveling to take someone's deposition, and then he wouldn't win the case. He'd lose it. And since he was a civil attorney, a lot of the money he would hopefully make came through settlements or judgments. It was getting to the point that Richard was talking about dissolving their partnership because he didn't want the liability. And from a personal finance point of view, the investigators thought Buckley appeared to be scraping by, and just barely. According to his financial records, he had $260,000 in debt. Now, that did include his mortgage and his car loans, but it also included credit cards. On top of this, it looked like he had an additional $80,000 in outstanding personal loans. While Buckley was, at the time, making all of his repayments on time, he was not behind on any of his bills. But how much longer would that last? He was still accruing debt even as he was making these payments. And Buckley had a life insurance policy on Richard. It was worth between $100,000 and $150,000. Mind you, Richard also had a life insurance policy on Buckley. It's pretty much the same thing we saw in the Marianne Clibbery Beyond the Files episode. Business partners often have life insurance policies on the other one, so the business can carry on in the event of one of their deaths. So it made sense why they had policies on each other, but it wouldn't be the first time we've seen someone kill someone else for the life insurance. There was also a $15,000 check that Richard had gotten from a client on the day of the attack. Rather than turn the check over to Richard's widow, Buckley deposited it into a law firm account only he had control over. So the motive here appeared to be financial. Richard was dissolving the partnership that Buckley needed more than Richard did, and the only way to come out ahead in this situation would be if Richard died. However, they still had this very tight window for him to have committed the crime, so the police would need some forensic evidence, which they found. They had taken Buckley's clothing into evidence and found 61 small spots of blood. They were on his shirt, his pants, and his shoes. They were determined to be high-velocity spatter, consistent with the pattern found at the crime scene. It was not consistent with getting it on him due to rendering first aid. So a theory of the crime was developed. Richard had told Buckley, or at least hinted at, the idea that he was ending their partnership. Buckley decided to cash in on that life insurance policy, so he waited for Shannon to leave the office. And then he waited for Richard to get off the phone. After he struck Richard, he had to move quickly. The CCTV footage showed that Buckley left and returned with his briefcase. And according to Shannon, it was unusual for him to bring a briefcase when he was going out for lunch. But it seemed like the perfect thing to use to smuggle the murder weapon out. However, they did not find any blood in the briefcase. They theorized that he must have put the murder weapon in a plastic bag and then put it into the briefcase. Whatever blood Buckley had on his hands, possibly his face, he washed off in the bathroom. He even admitted that he used the restroom before leaving the building. And then he left to establish his alibi. Not realizing the security cameras would tell on him, he told the police he left while Richard was still on the phone, making it seem impossible for him to have been the killer. When Buckley came back, he didn't see Shannon's vehicle, so he decided to wait outside until she got there, so that he didn't seem to have any more time alone with Richard in the office, and he would have a witness to find the body. Except they didn't find a body. They found Richard still alive, which panicked Buckley, so he dragged Richard across the floor in the hopes he would finish him off. Any attempts he made at first aid that Shannon witnessed were half-hearted at best, and there was a period of time Shannon didn't witness. She had initially called 911 from her desk phone, so she couldn't see what Buckley was doing for at least a minute or two until she transferred the call into Richard's office so that it was easier for her to give him instructions from the dispatcher. So we really have no idea what Buckley was doing, if anything, in at least that 1 minute window. So with all of this evidence, on May 23rd, 2.5 weeks after the murder, 49-year-old Richard Buckley was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and armed criminal action. Then 2 weeks later, on June 7th, a maintenance man at the building named Paul came forward. He told the police that he was in his truck outside of the Power and Light building talking to someone who was standing just outside of his truck. He saw Buckley leave at 2:10, and he was sure of the time because he had to be somewhere by 3, and he was keeping an eye on the clock. This further backed up that the timestamp on the security footage was behind by 3, possibly 4 minutes. Paul said that he was still in his truck when he saw Buckley come back about 30 minutes later, smoke a cigarette, and then go inside. And Paul was willing to testify to what he saw. Buckley made bond and was waiting for trial while he was still trying to make a living, and as you can imagine, that wasn't very successful given the high-profile nature of the crime he was charged with. Who hires a lawyer who's accused of killing his law partner? Buckley was in limbo and he did not like it, so his defense filed a motion for a speedy trial. The prosecution was not ready for this. They were still waiting on lab results that would not be ready in the time frame a speedy trial would have to happen. So they filed to drop the charges without prejudice so they could recharge Buckley later when they were ready. Buckley's attorney argued that the state was just trying to get around his right to a speedy trial, which that's exactly what they were doing. The defense argued that as long as this case was hanging over Buckley, he would not be free to move on with his life and rebuild his law practice. So they wanted a speedy trial or for the charges to be dismissed with prejudice, so Buckley couldn't be recharged. The judge sided with the state and decided to dismiss them without prejudice in April of 2001. The case, when all the results were in, was then taken to a grand jury again in January of 2002, and Richard Buckley was again charged. But this time, he was charged with first-degree murder, not second-degree murder. And in Missouri, this is a huge difference in sentencing. First-degree murder convictions will never result in a chance of parole. If you think about the Dee Dee Blanchard case, we have Nicholas Godejohn, who was convicted of first-degree murder, and Gypsy Blanchard, who pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. And one of them is out of prison. So Richard Buckley was facing first-degree murder, which meant life without parole. And as always, we have our pretrial motions. And during this process, the defense claimed that the state withheld all of the results of their blood spatter tests, and they were not complying with discovery. So what happened was each side had 2 experts trying to say how Richard's blood got on Buckley's clothing. The defense said it happened when Buckley clapped, trying to get Richard to come to. He had just dragged Richard several feet, so it made sense he would have gotten some blood on his hands. The state said they ran experiments that showed it was impossible to have happened that way. For one, if Buckley was kneeling as he said, his shoes would have been blocked and would not have gotten blood on them. Also, there were 2 spots on the back of his shirt, which was more consistent with swinging a weapon behind him. The state then hired a 3rd expert who was a rebuttal for the defense report, and that was the information the state wasn't turning over. The judge agreed that yes, the state should have turned all of this over earlier, but it wasn't late enough or egregious enough to dismiss the case. And this really isn't uncommon to see in pretrial arguments. I tend not to bring them up because they're so common. There is often a complaint about how much information the state provided and when they provided it. But in this case, I am noting it because this was the first time the defense accused the state of not following the rules in relation to discovery, but it was not going to be the last. This case went to trial in July of 2002. We've mostly hit on the state's case throughout the episode, so let's jump into the defense. According to Buckley's side of things, there was no motive. Yes, he had debt, but he was never delinquent on any payments, and according to an expert they called to the stand, his upcoming cases were likely to bring in a sizable amount of money. When you are a civil litigation attorney, it is not uncommon to have periods of time where you're not bringing in much because your cases are all pending. And then there are periods where multiple settlements are coming in quick succession, which brings in more cash. Taking out loans during the lien period is not uncommon. And it's not like Buckley had a ton of debt and no assets. He had some equity in his home, and he had at least $30,000 in his savings account. If he was so broke, you'd imagine you would see a second mortgage and nothing in savings. Additionally, Buckley didn't make much money from Richard's death, according to the defense. When it came to the $15,000 check, he deposited it the way Richard had intended to do so before he was attacked, and he did give the family $10,000 of that money. As for the life insurance, he signed it over to Richard's family.
Let's be honest. Most of us have a love-hate relationship with wired bras. We love the lift, but hate the digging. We love the support, but hate feeling trapped. Well, Knix just changed everything with FreeFlex, a wired bra actually designed to work with your body, not against it. FreeFlex features a revolutionary, flexible wire that moves when you move, bends when you bend, and keeps everything exactly where you want it. No poking, no stabbing, no constant readjusting, just freedom to move. It also has a demi-cup shape for a natural lift with a lower neckline that flatters in everything from V-necks to dresses. And because it's from Knix, it's available in sizes for every body. Experience the first wired bra you'll actually want to wear all day. Visit Knix.com for 15% off your order with FreeFlex15. That's KNIX.com, code FreeFlex15 for 15% off. Knix.com.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
The state pointed out that it did take him 1.5 years to sign the life insurance over, but Buckley said he would have done it immediately if, quote, all this hadn't happened. Now, I took that to mean that if he wasn't arrested, the money would have paid out sooner and he could have signed it over earlier. But since he was a suspect in the murder, the insurance company wouldn't have paid it out for a while. But I think this argument cuts both ways. Because would Buckley have signed it over to the family if they had paid it out to him directly and immediately? Or did he only sign it over because they were refusing to pay it out to a suspect in a murder, and because he was facing criminal charges and needed to eliminate his motive? There's no way we can know what he would have done. That said, there were other ways Buckley could have profited from this, but he didn't. Richard's collections clients, those were fairly low effort for what they paid, and they could have shored up Buckley's own practice if he was as failing of an attorney as the state claimed. But Buckley instead referred them out to a different attorney. And as for the organ transplant clients, that wasn't work just anyone could pick up, and they all had to find new representation. So we had both sides debating the motive, and then we get to the battle of experts over the blood spatter. The state had 2 experts testify with varying confidence about the blood spatter not being from clapping. And then the defense's experts testified that he should have had more blood on him if he had killed Richard. And one of them, Dr. Henry Lee, you may have heard of him, He testified that there was no brain matter found on Buckley's clothing in spite of it being in the blood at the scene. So how did he dodge the brain matter but not the blood? The defense also took on the investigation, pointing out some gaps, like how the police did not check a back door to the office, and they also did not test some other things that were found at and near the crime scene. Things like an earring, a soda can, and some cigarette butts. There was also an unexplained bloody footprint in Buckley's office that was not preserved because the investigators assumed it was from a police officer. But we don't know that because they didn't actually try to prove or disprove their assumption. Buckley then testified in his own defense, and he had to answer for some inconsistencies in his statements to the police, like how he did not mention clapping to them when he was asked how blood got onto his clothing. He said it's because he didn't realize at that time that that could have been the source, and we know he was not lying about clapping because Shannon had witnessed it. Buckley also said he never told the police that he left at exactly 1:50. He was estimating what time he left to the best of his recollection, but he knew that he left while Richard was on the phone. He used the bathroom, he waited on the elevator, and then he wrote it down to the ground floor. And that's something the defense pointed out. Even if Buckley walked out of the building at 2:10, did he have time to commit this murder? The earliest the murder could have happened was 2:02, but it could have been a minute or two later if we're giving Richard time to connect the dial-up modem and load that website. Then, if this was Buckley who did this, he would have had to kill Richard with at least 9 blows, somehow avoiding any major transfer of blood, wrap up the murder weapon in a bag and put it in his briefcase, go to the bathroom to wash up as best he could, wait for the elevator, and then take it down. Even if the elevator was open and waiting for him in the hall, it would have taken a full minute to go down the 13 stories and walk out the door. We have the maintenance man saying he left at 2:10, but based on the timestamp compared to the detective's pager, let's say it was 2:09. He didn't have 7 minutes to kill Richard. He had 7 minutes to kill Richard and do all that other stuff. It seemed like a stretch, but if not Buckley, then who? Who else had the motive, means, or opportunity? And then the state caught Buckley in an untruth on the stand. He was asked about the $15,000 that Richard had been given the day of the attack. Buckley said he put $10,000 of it in the law firm account that he controlled, $4,000 in a joint account for law firm bills, and $1,000 in Richard's personal account. He said that was Richard's plan for the money, and had he turned it all over to Richard's account, it would have gotten tied up in probate. So that's why he divided it up the way he did. The state then produced a deposit slip that showed that the full $15,000 went into the account Buckley controlled. According to Joe Lamb with the Kansas City Star, Buckley seemed surprised to see that deposit slip, and he said he hadn't found that slip. And that is why I am calling this an untruth rather than saying flat out it was a lie. Buckley would have known the bank could have given that documentation to the police, so why would he have intentionally lied about it? It would have totally destroyed his credibility on the stand. And so I'm not 100% convinced he intended to lie. He said he hadn't found that deposit slip. So what it sounded like to me was that he didn't remember what he did with the money. He went through his bank records and saw these deposits for $10K and $4K and $1K into these different accounts, and he thought that was the $15,000. I do think it's possible he just didn't remember. The only commentary I found about Buckley's overall performance on the stand was that he came across as arrogant, which never plays well to a jury. And we saw that on July 30th, 2002, when this jury convicted him of first-degree murder. He was then sentenced to life without parole. As Buckley left the courthouse, he told the media that he did not kill Richard Armitage. And this is as far into the timeline as the forensic files got into the case, and what comes next is why they have pulled the episode. Buckley's direct appeal was denied, and then he appealed again on two major points. The first was that the prosecution only turned over a segment of the surveillance video from the day of the attack, not the entire thing, and second, that his defense was ineffective. So first, we have the tape. The state told the defense and the judge that they only had a portion of the tape, starting at 1:13 p.m. and running less than an hour and a half. For some reason, the original tape had been destroyed, so they only had the excerpt left. The defense learned at trial that this was not true. They wanted to play the tape for the jury. I'm not entirely sure why. It's possible they wanted to show how casually Buckley left the building. He certainly didn't look like someone who just killed someone and was in a rush to go establish an alibi. He really just strolled out. The defense then learned that the tape did not start at 1:13 p.m. It actually started at 6:49 a.m. The state did, in fact, have the entire thing. The defense raised this issue that they had not gotten the whole tape before trial, but it seems like the matter was just dropped, which would then play into the ineffective assistance of counsel claim. They didn't end up playing the video at all, possibly because they didn't have time to preview it. The Crime Scene Confidential episode on this case presents this in a bizarre way. They said that no one wanted to watch the full thing, so it was trimmed down, and it got, quote, translated to the full video was not available, end quote. But that's not a translation. That's what the state said. In English. They said the full thing wasn't available when it was, and the state even conceded that point on the appeal. They said the tape was both favorable to Buckley and that they suppressed it. I don't know why Crime Scene Confidential is sweeping for the state when the state themselves don't even defend it. But the state only conceded 2 of the 3 things needed for a Brady violation. The only thing they didn't agree to was that the tape was material, that it would have made a difference in the verdict. So why should we care that a true crime TV show misrepresented what happened in this appeal? I'm glad you asked. It's because it feeds into a common misconception about convictions being overturned based on technicalities. For starters, those technicalities are what we usually call constitutional rights. And second, while the appellate process has a lot of flaws, almost none of them are in the favor of the convicted. The appellate process in the United States needs to be looked at critically, and feeding into a false narrative out there about it does absolutely no one any good. And I promise your true crime show will make you just as much money if you told the truth. Anyway, the judge sided with Buckley and in no uncertain terms. She ruled that not only had the prosecutors withheld the entire tape, the tape proved one of their witnesses had committed perjury. Remember Paul the maintenance man who came forward to say what time he saw Buckley come and go? If you remember, he said there was a man standing outside his truck when he saw Buckley leave. Well, his truck was visible in the surveillance footage, but there was no man standing there when Buckley left. And Paul could not have seen him come back because, according to the security footage, he had already driven away. The state knew the tape proved Paul was not telling the truth, yet they allowed him to testify anyway because they needed the maximum timeline possible for Buckley to have killed Richard. And the person who gives them the 2:10 p.m. leaving time is Paul. The state also had CCTV tapes from the day after the crime, May 6th, and it showed Paul going into the building and, based on the appellate report, going to the 13th floor. However, Paul had testified at trial that he left for vacation that day. So Paul's testimony was not accurate, and the state knew that, and they put him on the stand anyway. On top of that, there was something on that tape that called into question how slow the camera's clock was running. The tape was recovered the night of the beating, and according to the detective, he got it at 5:40 p.m. The final timestamp on it was 5:39:50, 10 seconds earlier. If the surveillance camera clock was running 3 to 4 minutes slow, why wasn't the last timestamp 5:37? Buckley and his attorney did not know when the final timestamp was because they were not given the tape past 2:39. Having this full tape early enough that they could have previewed it and made notes would have allowed them to rebut the claims made by the state and present evidence that the 2:06 timestamp could have been accurate, and that would not have given him nearly enough time to have committed the murder. Now, there are other explanations for this timestamp discrepancy. Maybe it was 5:43 when the detective got the tape, but for some reason it got recorded as 5:40. That's a possibility that the state could have countered with, but they didn't have to because Buckley was never given this exculpatory evidence, and this evidence could have changed the outcome of the trial. During this appeal process, the state also admitted that they could not verify with the internet company what time Richard had connected to the internet, even though they presented the time as though 2:02 was the time he did it. Not that it was just the earliest time he could have done it. For all the state knew, Richard didn't get online until minutes after hanging up the phone, giving Buckley no time to commit the murder, regardless if he left at 2:06 or 2:10. Buckley's attorney had never been told about the unfruitful investigation into Richard's internet usage, and by not pushing on these issues, particularly with the security footage, that bolstered the ineffective assistance of counsel claims. The defense did not pursue the evidence hard enough, and had they looked into this more, they would have wondered, why did Paul come forward to implicate Buckley? Why wasn't his testimony backed up by what was on the security footage? If the defense wondered these things and thought it seemed a little odd and looked into Paul a little bit more, they would have learned that Richard Armitage had complained to the building management about Paul. There were additional complaints of harassment against Paul coming from women who worked in the building. These complaints could have cost him his job. The judge noted in her decision that Paul was a convicted felon, but I looked him up and only found drug charges, which isn't really the same thing to me as if he was a violent felon, but there may be charges I just didn't see. The judge wrote that Paul fit the profile of the killer, but no one looked into him. So with that, she granted Buckley a new trial. The state appealed, but it was upheld in late 2007, and Buckley was released on bond in January of 2008 to await retrial. He had served 5 years in prison. For the new trial, they had to bring in a judge from another county to oversee it, since all of the Jackson County judges recused themselves. That's more than a dozen judges who couldn't touch this case due to a conflict, which I think we could expect here because of how many attorneys are involved. We have the victim's an attorney, the defendant, and of course, the original prosecutors who violated Buckley's rights the first time around. The retrial was scheduled for January of 2009, but then it was delayed because, you're not even going to believe this, the prosecutor assigned, Dan Miller, had another case overturned because he failed to turn over exculpatory evidence in that other case. The judge called it a, quote, continuing fraud on the courts, and Dan Miller ended up being investigated for possible disciplinary action. So these other trials were delayed, which included Buckley's, and they finally had a new trial date set for January 2011. The defense, however, was still having trouble getting discovery from the state, so the judge set a deadline of July 20th, 2010. Everything had to be turned over. The defense waited on the information they requested, which included financial documents, and when they were not sent over, they filed a motion for sanctions. In September of 2010, this motion was heard. The state said they had turned over a lot of the evidence, most of it even, but it turned out they had at least 22 boxes of financial documents they never turned over. Since the motive in this case that they were going to argue was financial, these records were pretty important to the defense. And mind you, these were documents they had from before the first trial. They had them for 10 years and didn't turn them over to the first set of defense attorneys or the second. And in 10 years, how many excuses do you have for not turning them over? The judge found that the state could not even articulate what their evidence was or what documents they had that they still needed to turn over. They were, in the judge's opinion, ignoring the rules, and they ignored the court's deadline. Calling it a, quote, 10-year pattern of discovery abuse, the judge ordered all of their evidence inadmissible at trial. In Missouri, a judge can exclude evidence solely based on discovery violations. But I have never heard of a judge excluding all of the evidence. The state, of course, appealed, and the appellate court upheld the decision in a majority ruling, but there were 2 dissenting judges that basically said that the public's right to have this case prosecuted outweighed the effect on Buckley's rights. But since the majority upheld the circuit court's ruling, it stood. With no evidence to take back to trial, the DA's office dismissed the charges in May of 2012, and in April of 2013, Buckley managed to have his disbarment reversed, because the only reason they revoked his law license and disbarred him was because of the murder, and he was no longer convicted of it. After the charges were dismissed, Richard's widow, Kathy, spoke to the media. She had stayed quiet for years so as to not impact the process, but there was no process left to protect. She was justifiably angry, and in my opinion, she directed it to the right place, the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office. The system failed Richard, Kathy, and the children by not preserving Buckley's rights. If they had done it right and Buckley was convicted, appeals would just be something happening in the background of their lives, and the person they believed killed Richard would still be in prison. I think it's a stark reminder that it's not just the defendants who are at the mercy of the system, it's the victims and their families. And there is little Kathy or Buckley can do about it because of qualified immunity. Richard gets no justice, and the prosecutors just keep going. The Forensic Files episode had one of the talking heads talk about how Buckley was not a good attorney, but I have to say, at least he didn't cheat to convict someone like the prosecutor they interviewed for this episode. And I'm bringing this up because this is not a one-off for that prosecutor. Amy McGowan was the prosecutor in not just this case, but also the Ricky Kidd case, which is a pretty big one here in Kansas City. Ricky was convicted in a double homicide that he did not commit, and his conviction was overturned in 2019. And it was another case where McGowan had withheld exculpatory evidence. Ricky Kidd is one of the most inspirational people you're ever going to encounter. Just look him up. He's done nothing but give back to the community since his release. He has an upbeat attitude when he has every reason not to. At the time of Ricky's release, McGowan was no longer working for the Jackson County prosecutor, but rather for the Douglas County DA over in Kansas. There were protests calling for her to be fired over Ricky's case, and as the public scrutiny and public pressure ramped up, she retired. Disciplinary action was not taken in spite of the accusations in Buckley's case, Ricky's case, and other cases of misconduct. There was a 2013 child exploitation case that was vacated because of improper comments she made in court, and that was just one of 5 other cases like that. And then we have Keith Carnes, who was released after 18 years in prison after he was wrongfully convicted of murder, with a witness coming forward and saying that McGowan pressured her into identifying Keith Carnes. Amy McGowan was allowed to quietly retire, and the Forensic Files just took the episode off the air and off of streaming platforms like it never happened. But for the people who spent time in prison and the families of victims who will never get justice due to prosecutorial misconduct, it can't be erased that easily.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.